The God of Philosophy by the Reverend Francis Aveling, Doctor of Divinity, 1906. Preface. In the following pages I have attempted no more than to restate in simple language and upon the old philosophical basis the natural proofs by which the existence of God is demonstrated. As far as I know, there is no small and handy English treatise upon the subject that attempts to deal with its matter upon the plan here adopted. The literature bearing upon this important philosophical question is exceedingly voluminous. Perhaps more has been written upon it than upon any other subject of human interest. Great thinkers of every age and nation have labored upon the point, but, apart from the grave initial difficulty of the languages in which their results have been stated, there is the further disadvantage that their work is scattered through almost countless volumes and fragments, making it no easy matter to gather its results, or the method by which they were acquired, into any one compendious form. The methods to which I refer have been very various, some of them satisfying the logical requirements of natural reason, some relying upon factors that critical reason seems to be unable to approve. The methods of rationalism and the inference of spiritualism are not those of mysticism or illumination, but these diverse methods are all issue in an acknowledgment of one supreme and spiritual being, the cause and the end of all things. It is to those who desire, and with every right, a purely rational and intellectual treatment of the subject that the following pages are addressed. The fascinating persuasions of mysticism are deliberately omitted as not capable of a rational explanation without a laborious and possibly a fallacious accommodation of thought and language. What may, perhaps, be admitted in the case of the individual does not always hold good universally, and consequently no other lines of proof than those capable of bearing an entirely rational scrutiny are advanced. A so-called proof, however, it must be remembered, is the detailed statement of a line of reasoning by which the human mind, acting normally, has from certain fixed and immutable first principles of thought reached the conclusions necessarily involved in the mental process. In order to be understood, the so-called proof must be assimilated. It can have no value whatever in forcing conviction. It does not produce certainty, it records it. And the whole psychological process of the demonstrations advanced must be gone through step by step and personally before the conclusion reached can have any real meaning or be of any evidential value. With this restriction of the arguments adduced, and in this view of the nature of so-called proof, the several demonstrations are urged as absolutely incontrovertible. The first 4 chapters are concerned with certain preliminary considerations necessitated by the nature of the arguments themselves. It seemed to be better to treat the general principles, method, and distinctions separately, in order that the actual arguments might not be cumbered with explanations which might draw the attention from the main point. The reader for whom such a preparation of the ground is unnecessary will find the proofs, from chapter 5 onward, set out in order with as little extraneous matter as possible. A far more diffuse style might have been adopted, and the examples and analogies more fully explained and worked out in greater detail, but the disadvantages arising from such a style would seem to be greater than those of a more brief and reasoned method. The direct line of reasoning is apt to be lost in the merely explanatory portions, and the reader to be wearied with much that is either too abstruse or too commonplace for him. Hence, I trust far more to his enlarging and filling in for himself the few examples adduced, and to his perfecting upon his own lines the analogies outlined, rather than drawn in full. F. Aveling, Westminster, March 7th, 1906. Contents. Chapter Preface. Chapter 1. Tendencies of Modern Thought. Chapter 2. First Principles, Real and Ideal Orders, Sensation, Causality. Chapter 3. The Method of Demonstration. Chapter 4. A Fundamental Distinction, Possible and Actual Existence. Chapter 5. The Necessary Being. Chapter 6. The First Moving Power. Chapter 7. The First Cause. Chapter 8. The Creator of Life. Chapter 9. The Author of Harmony and Design. Chapter 10. The Perfection of Being. Chapter 11. The Lawgiver. Chapter 12. Confirmatory Physical Arguments. Chapter 13. Confirmatory Moral Arguments. Chapter 14. Identification of the Results. Chapter 15. The Nature of God. Chapter 16. The Personality of God. The God of Philosophy. Chapter 1. Tendencies of Modern Thought. Epigram. Whatever may be said against philosophy as an instrument for construction, it is certainly valuable when we come to deal with the unconscious dogmatism into which men of science are apt to fall. From Haldane, The Pathway to Reality. Is there a God? Can we know that there is a God? Can we prove that there is a God? These are practical questions, since, in light of an affirmative or negative answer, all human affairs must be understood and regulated. They are questions perhaps more, and certainly not less opportune now than at any other period in the history of the human race. For the age in which we live is one of the strictest investigation and of the most searching criticism. Nothing, no doctrine, theory, or opinion is excluded from it. History, science, philosophy, theology, all alike must make good their assertions or be rejected. Theory, hypothesis, and statement, coming from no matter what source, are dragged before the bar of human reason to render an account of themselves, and nothing can long escape a merited censure that cannot clearly and straightforwardly make itself approved to the mind. A highly significant and noteworthy change is taking place in modern scientific teaching and in modern philosophy. The first is seen to be in abandoning positions which, a few years back, it claimed to be impregnable. It is progressing, and as it registers and tabulates the results of its researches, it dogmatizes less, speculates less wildly, is more anxious to join its forces to those of that same philosophy that it formerly stigmatized as a mere tissue of word-weaving and an anti-progressive brake upon the wheel of advance. The science of the 20th century is realizing more and more its descriptive function. It is going back to its old and far more exact methods, and it is looking to philosophy as to a separate department of thought based on other foundations and pursuing other methods than its own, for a solution of the great problems that the existence of the world sets before every thinking mind. And philosophy, in its more recent forms and aspects, is drawing closer to the path in which it originally trod. The convergence of modern thought, of both the purely scientific and the philosophical, upon the ancient lines, appears the more remarkable when we recollect how utterly those lines were obliterated by the destructive thought systems introduced since the decadence of scholastic philosophy. Even now, the old principles are almost entirely unknown to those new explorers who are steadily, and apparently quite unconsciously, drawing closer to them. It is difficult to suppose that any one system of philosophy could be begun and perfected by an individual. The completed system, as we know it, has invariably been the work of a school, the result of many tentative efforts, and thus, when we discover, as indeed we do in the literature that gives expression to the mental attitude of the day, that a vital current is running through the stream of modern thought towards a philosophy that has twice at least occupied the unique position of being practically universal, and a philosophy that has never ceased to exert a very great influence upon the thinking world, we are with some reason encouraged to hope that it has set in the right direction. More than this, modern philosophy is notably fitting itself in more closely with the common sense of those thinking men who are not philosophers by profession or habit. It is abandoning the shallows of crude materialism into which it was forced by thought systems that are passing out of vogue, and it is leaving the thick mists of an idealism in which it seemed to have no real sustainability and certainly exerted no marked influence on mankind as a whole. Still, great and fundamental changes such as these, which seem to be working themselves out toward a definitive end, do not take place quickly. An individual may replace an old with a new theory in a day, but as a general rule, even the growth of theory into popular esteem is slow, and the final modification of systems require many years of patient labor, during which not a few workers contribute their quota to the final results. This is indeed one of the best safeguards that a theory or system can have while it is in the making. Isolated investigation, testing, corroboration, correction, the opposition of counter-theories, all these go towards establishing it upon a sound basis, a basis strong enough to justify its popular adoption, so long as it explains the facts it professes to explain, and while it is not contradicted by other certain truths or newer and incompatible facts. In the infancy of the exact sciences, it was natural that the discoveries that were made and the hypotheses that were framed should receive a defense altogether disproportionate to their true value in the totality of knowledge. Now that science has grown older, adding enormously to her store of facts, their truer worth is being perceived. The more the possible vistas of science are opened up, the more it is the need of a general reconstructive philosophy realized to coordinate and explain the vast mass of facts and records coming from all the sciences in one coherent thought system. The experimental scientist who, until a comparatively recent date, announced his latest discovery to the world with a great blare of trumpets and drew from it the most far-reaching theoretical conclusions with a confidence as astounding as it was naive, is now, for the most part, contented with modestly chronicling and cataloging his facts, or, at most, perhaps, indulging in a little harmless speculation concerning them. For the modern scientist is learning the humility of knowledge. He begins to realize that his one science alone is insufficient, and indeed, properly speaking, does not attempt to explain the true natures and reasons of things. The philosopher is now more tentative than dogmatic and more critical than constructive. He, too, is learning his lesson, the humility of wisdom. The truth of the matter is that the scientist and the philosopher both realize that neither can do without the other in the attempt to solve problems appealing to them both as men with equal force. They must work hand in hand, and consequently the scientist is giving up his attempt to construct an ideal interpretation of the world from the limited materials at his disposal, just as the philosopher is striving to bring his guiding principles into closer touch with the recorded facts of the exact sciences. And thus, the inevitable result is slowly but surely being brought about. The gap caused by the divorce of science and philosophy and widened by their respective progress on either side along totally divergent lines is being filled by the mutually related contributions of both. To what precise final theories this fusion of sciences will lead, what system will be born anew from this union of forces, it is difficult to predict with any semblance of certainty, but it is safe to say that the materialism of the one will go far to tone down the hazy idealism of the other, while the same idealism will help to raise the purely materialistic solution of problems to a new and more intellectual plane. We shall have a true thought system related to all the results of exact experiment, which will be at once idealistic and materialistic. It is fairly safe to say that it will be a realistic thought system, in the best sense of the word, as the perfection and continuation of the realism of common sense. In any case, whatever the outcome may be, the noteworthy tendency to be observed at present is towards a system of philosophy as old, in its general outline and construction, as that of Aristotle. But a fact of perhaps yet greater importance still remains to be noticed. The problems that for centuries have been almost, though by no means altogether, out of the reach of the masses have now become so vulgarized that there is hardly anyone of even modern attainments who ignores them. The very pretensions of the attacks that have been made upon philosophy from time to time in the name of science have possibly done more than all else to awaken a new interest in the old questions, and while some of the guesses and hypotheses of the sciences, useful enough in their proper place, but falling short as explanations of reality, have had the effect of confusing the real problems, they have at any rate raised them afresh. The keen interest taken in the most fundamental questions of philosophy and in the latest and most up-to-date discoveries of science is by no means confined now to the study of the man of letters or to the laboratory of the chemist or biologist. Perhaps one of the most encouraging of the many encouraging signs of the times is the enormous and intelligent interest taken by the ordinary men and women in these questions. Knowledge is no longer the monopoly of the scholar. If he requires a monopoly, he must turn to his learning, for knowledge has set up her throne at every street corner. In the school, the free library, the daily paper, the working man finds his academy and his cursus philosophicus, and he has every right to knowledge, for his reason is essentially the same as that of the scholar. His intellect, though possibly not so highly trained, is quite as capable of dealing with the common problems. He only lacks the opportunities, the leisure, and the sometimes cumbrous apparatus of critical learning. It is unfortunate that philosophical writers have clothed their teaching in a language which it is difficult for him to understand. Perhaps to some extent this was inevitable. What is more unfortunate is that conflicting schools and popular usage have rendered common terms so ambiguous and common phrases so misleading, but only express a philosophical truth in words which he does understand, and his intelligence has no difficulty in grasping its import, for nature has made him fundamentally a philosopher. Footnote on "for nature has made him fundamentally a philosopher." Quote, "The most ignorant man who knows a language possesses an incredible treasure of ideas. In the simplest conversation we may find many physical, metaphysical, and moral ideas. Take the following sentence, which is within the comprehension of the lowest mind. I did not wish to pursue the beast farther for fear that, becoming irritated, he might do me harm. Here are the ideas of time, act of the will, action, continuity, space, causality, analogy, end, and morality. Time passed, I did not. Act of the will, wish. Action, to pursue. Continuity of space, farther. Analogy, becoming irritated. Since, from irritation in other instances, it is inferred in the present, and it is also known from what happens to ourselves if molested. Motive and end, for fear that irritated, etc. Causality, he might do me harm. Morality, not to harm others. Balmez, Fundamental Philosophy, translated by Henry F. Brownson, Masters of Arts, Volume 2, Book 10, Chapter 17. I may add to the above catalog ideas those of personality, I, individuality, the beast, change, becoming irritated, do me harm, hypothesis of impossibility, might do me harm, reality in attributing my not wishing to pursue the beast and its possible irritation, ideal representation in the use of words. End footnote. And if lack of education has deprived him of a firm grasp and a deep knowledge of the medium of thought, if he is not a grammarian in the old sense of the term, his ideas, in most cases, are as accurately, though perhaps not as comprehensively, formed as those of his more fortunately circumstanced fellow men. His principal difficulty consists not in forming an idea or understanding it when formed, but in formulating and expressing it in or abstracting it from words. Of course, it is not for a moment to be supposed that all men, without any distinction, have the same comprehensive grasp upon or deep insight to the principles and conclusions of philosophy. Such a statement would be manifestly false, but what is meant is that if philosophical truth is only suitably expressed, it is calculated to appeal as much to the unlearned as to the learned. The intelligence of each is at its root precisely the same. Truth does not merely consist in words. The child, come to age of reason, grasps the idea of first principles as quickly as the man does, and he understands their truth in precisely the same manner. Only since all that is received is fashioned and shaped to the capacity of the recipient, there is ample room for an indefinite number of cases in which the content of knowledge differs in extent and intensity. And so the aim of philosophy is not to produce faith, nor to enforce its teaching by the mere authority of its teachers, but to induce knowledge in its learners by simply showing them the inherent reasonableness of its first principles, and by allowing them to perceive for themselves the real strength and value of the proofs it employs. In laying stress upon these considerations, which scarcely amount to more than truism, no attempt is made to minimize the very real difficulties in the way of becoming proficient in such a science as philosophy. Like the acquisition of any other form of knowledge, it has many obstacles in its path. There is here no royal road. For philosophy, it may be observed, on account of the extremely abstract treatment of its subject which it employs, demands even more careful thought and painstaking study than any other branch of natural science. But even so, it is not necessary to have probed to their depth all the questions to which speculation has given birth, in order to have a sufficiently clear and accurate insight into principles which are sufficient for our intellectual and moral guidance. It is not necessary to have made a deep study of science in order to recognize certain of its truths, and it is not necessary to be deeply acquainted with metaphysics in order to perceive the certainties which with this science deals. We are not asking how, but is there a God? And these are quite different questions. After all is said and done, the demonstrations are valid or they are not. The conclusion drawn from them is true or untrue. And if the lines of reasoning are valid and the inference correct, the thinking man or woman and those to whom even the labyrinth of philosophical speculation is as yet entirely unexplored, for whom its technical terms and phrases present a more or less foreign and unknown appearance, have precisely the same intellectual nature as the keenest and most profound philosopher, and one has every right to trust to this in presenting any set of demonstrations that lays claims to being conclusive. The force and logic of the proofs advanced will appeal to the reason if the proofs are valid and the arguments sound. If for any reason one particular line of proof fails to convince, another may, perhaps, appeal with more direct force to the individual intelligence considering them all. The reader to whom the mechanical thought, if the expression may be allowed, of formal logic is not so familiar, and for whose mind any metaphysical ideas involved seem at first glance to be beyond comprehension, ought to bear in mind, however, that the formal ordering and arranging of proof always presents some such apparent difficulty. Until a certain faculty is acquired by training and study, we must perforce employ our natural logical faculty and more or less rough and ready, though always substantially correct, metaphysics. The warning is merely by way of a caution, for the natural faculty is generally quite trustworthy, unless it has received a false bias from without. The study of mathematics presents similar difficulties which are overcome by careful and exact thought on the part of the learner. And mathematical conclusions are in a sense more difficult to reach than those with which we have to deal here. For the mathematical sciences deal with a particular form of abstract thought, while metaphysics, though more abstract than mathematics, lies at the very foundation of all our thoughts. It is the logic and the metaphysics of nature, then, that are really the important factor in any deep investigation. A little attention will soon dispel any difficulty, if it exists, and make the reasoning clear. And if the formal arrangement of the proofs does seem somewhat hard and dry, the importance of the conclusions is more than enough to justify the labor involved in reaching them.